The Insurrection Act sits on the books like a loaded weapon from 1807, waiting for someone willing enough to pull it out of its constitutional holster. What we're witnessing now isn't just political theater or another headline designed to grab your attention for 60 seconds before you scroll to the next outrage. This is about the mechanics of power, the legal architecture that determines who controls the streets, who controls dissent, and ultimately, who controls the definition of order itself. When a president threatens to invoke this act, we're talking about deploying active-duty military forces against civilians on American soil, something that crosses a line most democratic nations abandoned generations ago. The economic implications alone should concern anyone paying attention. When capital sees instability, when investors watch military forces mobilizing domestically, when the global community observes a superpower turning its military inward rather than projecting power outward, the entire calculus of American economic hegemony shifts. This isn't about left versus right anymore. This is about whether the constitutional constraints we've relied on for over 2 centuries can actually contain the ambitions of someone determined to reshape the relationship between state power and civil society. The question isn't whether this threat is real. The question is what it reveals about the current structure of American power and where that structure is headed. Let's start by understanding what the Insurrection Act actually is, because most coverage you'll see reduces it to a talking point, a weapon in the culture war arsenal, without ever explaining the historical weight this piece of legislation carries. The act was originally passed in 1807, during Thomas Jefferson's presidency, and it was designed to give the federal government the ability to deploy military forces to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, or rebellion when state authorities couldn't or wouldn't handle it themselves. Now, that might sound reasonable on paper, and perhaps in 1807, when the federal government was still figuring out what federalism even meant, it made some sense. But what we're dealing with now, over 200 years later, is the potential weaponization of that same authority in a context that Jefferson and his contemporaries could never have imagined. The modern surveillance state, the militarization of police forces, the concentration of executive power, all of these developments have transformed what the Insurrection Act means in practice. When we hear Trump threatening to invoke this act, we need to place that threat within the broader pattern of authoritarian consolidation that we've been watching unfold, not just in the United States, but across the developed world over the past 2 decades. This isn't happening in a vacuum. The neoliberal economic order, which promised prosperity through deregulation, privatization, and the unleashing of market forces, has produced precisely the opposite of what it advertised. Instead of broadly shared wealth, we've seen historic levels of inequality. Instead of stable democracies strengthened by economic growth, we've seen the rise of strongman politics, nationalist movements, and the hollowing out of democratic institutions. The frustration people feel, the economic anxiety that permeates working-class communities across this country, creates the conditions where authoritarian promises start to sound appealing. And that's the context we need to understand when we analyze why someone would threaten to deploy the military against civilians. The genius of the Insurrection Act, from an authoritarian's perspective, is that it's already law. There's no need to pass new legislation, no need to convince Congress, no need to build public consensus. It's sitting there in the legal code, waiting to be activated. Previous presidents have invoked it, though rarely and usually in response to situations where there was at least some broad agreement that civil order had genuinely broken down. Eisenhower used it to enforce desegregation in Little Rock in 1957. George H.W. Bush invoked it during the Los Angeles riots in 1992. But those invocations came after extensive consultation, after state governors requested federal assistance, after it became clear that local and state resources were insufficient. What we're seeing now is different. The threat to invoke the Insurrection Act isn't coming as a last resort after all other options have been exhausted. It's being floated as a political tool, as a way to intimidate opponents, as a demonstration of willingness to cross lines that previous administrations understood were better left uncrossed. Now let's talk about what this means economically. Because everything that happens in politics ultimately connects back to material conditions and economic structures. The American economy, despite all the stock market highs and GDP growth figures that get thrown around, is fundamentally unstable for the majority of people actually living in it. Wages have stagnated for decades when measured against inflation and productivity gains. Housing costs have skyrocketed to the point where homeownership is becoming a distant dream for younger generations. Healthcare costs continue to consume larger and larger portions of household budgets. Student debt has reached levels that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. These aren't just statistics. They're the daily reality for tens of millions of Americans who work full-time jobs and still struggle to make ends meet. When you have this level of economic precarity, when people feel like the system isn't working for them, they become susceptible to authoritarian appeals that promise to restore order, to punish enemies, to make things great again through the exercise of raw power. The corporate class understands this dynamic very well, which is why we see such ambivalence from business leaders when it comes to authoritarian tendencies in politics. On one hand, instability is bad for business in the abstract. Markets prefer predictability, institutional continuity, the rule of law applied consistently. But on the other hand, the corporate class has benefited enormously from the very economic arrangements that have produced this instability for everyone else. Tax cuts, deregulation, the weakening of labor unions, the privatization of public services, all of these policies have transferred wealth upward on a scale that rivals the Gilded Age. So when someone threatens to invoke the Insurrection Act, when someone promises to crack down on protests or civil unrest, there's a part of the corporate establishment that sees this as potentially useful. After all, if economic conditions continue to deteriorate for working people, if inequality continues to widen, eventually you're going to see more social unrest, more demands for systemic change, more challenges to the existing distribution of wealth and power. From the perspective of capital, having a government willing to use military force to maintain order might start to look like a reasonable insurance policy. This is where we need to talk about the deeper structural forces at play, because individual personalities, even someone as volatile and norm-breaking as Trump, are ultimately products of and responses to larger systemic pressures. The American empire, which has dominated global affairs since the end of World War II, is in a period of relative decline. That doesn't mean it's collapsing tomorrow or that American power is suddenly irrelevant, but it does mean that the unipolar moment that followed the Cold War is definitively over. China's economic rise, the reassertion of Russian power in its near abroad, the increasing independence of traditional American allies in Europe, the failure of military interventions in the Middle East, all of these developments signal that American hegemony is being contested in ways it hasn't been for decades. When empires decline, when their global position becomes more tenuous, the political class at home often responds by turning inward, by focusing on domestic control rather than external projection of power. The threat to invoke the Insurrection Act fits perfectly into this pattern. It's not a sign of strength, it's a sign of weakness, an admission that the normal mechanisms of social control and political legitimacy aren't working as effectively as they once did. We also need to examine the role that media plays in normalizing these kinds of threats. When a president threatens to invoke the Insurrection Act, the way that threat gets covered matters enormously. If it's treated as just another controversial statement, another example of provocative rhetoric that we're all supposed to shake our heads at before moving on to the next story, then the effect is to gradually shift the Overton window of what's acceptable political discourse. This is how authoritarianism creeps forward, not usually through dramatic coups or sudden seizures of power, but through the slow erosion of norms, the gradual expansion of executive authority, the incremental weakening of checks and balances. Each boundary that gets crossed without serious consequences makes it easier to cross the next one. Each threat that gets issued without real pushback becomes normalized, incorporated into the baseline of what we expect from our political leaders. The media's failure to treat these developments with the gravity they deserve, to provide historical context and explain the stakes involved, is a form of complicity in the authoritarian project. Think about the international implications for a moment. The United States has spent the better part of a century positioning itself as the defender of democracy, the champion of human rights, the model that other nations should aspire to follow. That positioning has always been hypocritical to some degree, given America's long history of supporting dictatorships when it served economic or strategic interests, given the reality of systemic racism and inequality at home, given the violence of American foreign policy. But hypocrisy aside, the self-image of America as a democratic beacon has had real effects on global politics. It's given the United States moral authority to criticize authoritarian practices elsewhere, to impose sanctions, to build coalitions around democratic values. When an American president threatens to deploy the military against civilians, when the United States starts to look more like the authoritarian regimes it has criticized, that moral authority evaporates. Why should anyone listen to American lectures about democracy and human rights when America itself is sliding toward authoritarianism? The geopolitical consequences of this legitimacy crisis are profound, creating space for other powers to challenge American influence, to offer alternative models of governance, to build new international arrangements that don't center American preferences and values. Let's also consider the class dimensions of how the Insurrection Act might be deployed. When we talk about civil unrest or domestic disorder, we need to ask whose unrest, whose disorder, whose protests might trigger a military response. History provides a clear answer. It's always working-class movements, racial justice movements, labor organizing, anti-war protests, any form of collective action that challenges the existing distribution of wealth and power. When wealthy people riot, when they engage in financial crimes that destroy millions of lives, when they pollute the environment or exploit workers or evade taxes, we don't call in the military. We don't even call in the police most of the time. But when poor people protest police violence, when workers strike for better wages, when communities organize against environmental destruction, suddenly we hear about the need for order, the importance of law and law enforcement, the threat that these movements pose to stability. The Insurrection Act, like most tools of state power, will be deployed selectively, used against those who have the least power while exempting those who have the most. There's a profound moral dimension to all of this that can't be ignored. We're talking about a democratic society, or at least a society that claims to be democratic, where the fundamental principle is supposed to be government by consent of the governed. The entire legitimacy of the state rests on the idea that citizens have agreed to be bound by its laws and to accept its authority. When that authority becomes purely coercive, when it relies on military force rather than democratic legitimacy, the social contract breaks down. People obey not because they consent, but because they fear the consequences of disobedience. That's not democracy. That's tyranny dressed up in democratic clothing. And once you cross that line, once you establish the precedent that military force can be used against civilians who are exercising their constitutional rights to assemble and protest, you've fundamentally altered the nature of the political system. You can still call it democracy. You can still hold elections. You can still maintain the formal structures of democratic governance, but the substance has changed. Power flows from the barrel of a gun rather than from the ballot box. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is the combination of economic crisis, political polarization, and institutional decay that characterizes American society right now. None of these problems is new, but their convergence creates conditions where authoritarian solutions start to gain traction across the political spectrum. On the right, you have open calls for strongman leadership, for cracking down on crime and disorder, for using state power to enforce traditional values and hierarchies. On the liberal center, you have an establishment that has largely failed to address the economic grievances driving political instability, that has prioritized institutional preservation over substantive reform, that seems more concerned with restoring norms than with addressing the material conditions that have made those norms unsustainable. And on the left, which should be offering a genuine alternative, you have fragmentation, marginalization, a lack of institutional power that makes it difficult to mount effective opposition. This creates a vacuum where authoritarianism can flourish, where threats to invoke the Insurrection Act don't generate the kind of mass resistance they would in a healthier democracy. The question we need to ask ourselves is what comes next. If the threat to invoke the Insurrection Act is issued and nothing happens, if there's no significant political price to pay, if the institutions that are supposed to serve as checks on executive power remain silent or impotent, then we can expect the threats to escalate. Maybe next time it won't be just a threat. Maybe next time there will be actual deployment of troops in American cities, actual military confrontation with civilians exercising their constitutional rights. And once that line is crossed, once the precedent is established, it becomes part of the normal toolkit of governance. Future presidents, regardless of party, will know that this option is available to them. The ratchet only turns one direction. Powers once claimed by the executive branch are almost never voluntarily relinquished. This is how democracies die, not with a bang but with a whimper, not through dramatic coups, but through the gradual accumulation of authoritarian practices that eventually transform the entire character of the political system. We're living through a historical moment where the contradictions of American capitalism and American democracy are becoming impossible to ignore. The system that promised prosperity and freedom has delivered neither for growing numbers of people. The institutions that were supposed to protect rights and constrain power have proven inadequate to the task. The economic model that dominated the post-Cold War era has produced crisis after crisis, each one deepening inequality and eroding social cohesion. Into this vacuum step authoritarian figures who promise simple solutions, who offer scapegoats to blame, who pledge to restore order through force. The threat to invoke the Insurrection Act is just one manifestation of this broader dynamic, but it's a particularly revealing one because it strips away the pretense and shows us the reality of power in its rawest form. This is what's at stake when democratic legitimacy fails, when consent can no longer be manufactured through the usual mechanisms of ideology and institutional authority. What remains is force, the threat of violence, the military occupation of your own country. That's the path we're on, unless we collectively decide to change direction, unless we build the kind of mass movements that can challenge both the authoritarian right and the failed neoliberal center, unless we create genuine alternatives that address people's material needs and restore faith in the possibility of democratic governance. The choice is ours, but the window for making that choice is closing fast.